I will keep asking questions as we go along, but I think at this point I want to open the floor to the participants. Any questions from your side? Yeah, please. Yeah.
This is this is a question primarily for the two, Christina and Kelly, because you are from the banking background and you are trying to look at the investment patterns. Whenever a program or project is designed, we have a boundary line, and within that boundary line, you try to address as many information, like baseline information, as somebody was asking. Typically, in a climate change scenarios, particularly when World Bank is working across the continents and the ADB across countries within Asia, I really wonder, you only mosaic, I mean, you invest in mosaic patterns, in mosaic of countries as to whether it is for mitigation or adaptation. So when you are looking at a higher global indicators, because generally you have the global indicators and local indicators, etc. At the global indicators, perhaps you will get the so-called loosely held indicators, if I may say that. So how do you really define this boundary when you are talking about investment in across the countries and other things? Because this is a challenge for evaluation for you, because both of you are in the evaluation office, I guess, in your respective offices. And when carbon is across the globe and it is not necessarily confined to a country, how do you assess your outcome level or even impact level indicators at that level? I really wonder.
I'll try to answer it in two parts really quickly. In regard to the global evaluation that's currently taking place with regard to the SIFs, there will be specific country visits and case studies within the individual countries. So you will be able to get a micro perspective, or at least that is what is expected from the actual evaluation. And it's true, the second part that I plan to address is, it's true, there is not a one-size-fits-all approach for the evaluation or for the application of lessons learned. Even with regard to that which I spoke about today in terms of measuring market transformation, there are limitations to what you can do because of the expense involved, as well as limitations with regard to lessons learned. And there is opportunity for a participatory approach, which may or may not be in current frameworks. I don't see them in current frameworks, and that is a collaborative process that continues or exists on a continuation basis, where the stakeholders come together not just at the time of evaluation, but during the implementation process. It could be the IA, the implementing agency, or the EA, the executive agency, that orchestrates this quarterly meeting of stakeholders to look at what's happening in terms of outputs, to talk about quantitative as well as qualitative output. That is something that needs to be done on a regular basis, and it can be participatory. So yes, even when you have findings that ultimately come from that also go to results, you can't simply say, okay, well, this has got to be applied to the entire region or to the global perspective. There are limitations, and we have to respect those limitations.
Let me just quickly clarify something which I think may be difficult to understand for our audience. While Kelly, at the same time, we are talking two different things. It's both related to the climate investment funds. At the moment, an independent evaluation of the climate investment funds as a whole is being undertaken, and it's being sort of commissioned by the Trust Fund Committee, who want to know how well are the CIF as a whole performing, how is this innovative exercise doing at a global scale. Whilst I come from the Climate Investment Funds Admin Unit, and I am on the operational side of things. In the Climate Investment Funds Admin Unit, we are working to establish a robust tracking of results system, a monitoring and reporting system, to get a handle on what's happening day to day in how do those programs evolve on the ground. And this is where I'm talking about the 5 core indicators, which each program and each program will measure consistently, which means these are not the exclusive and only indicators, but it's the ones that should be measured by every country, which means that in each country there will be specific other indicators which are very relevant to your certain particular situation and context. So these 5 core are not the only ones. So this is just to explain the difference between me talking about the climate investment funds, M&E work, and Kelly talking about the independent evaluation of the animal as a whole.
Yeah, it's an important point to understand, because what clearly Christine's team, and her team is doing is basically defining the core set which is common across all countries. This is not to say that this is the only indicators list that the countries would use. Their countries have flexibility to define their own. The idea is to be able to do benchmarking across countries. So that's the point that we're making. We have, I think, since we began 15 minutes late, do we have, okay, great. So you wanted to ask a question, please.
Thank you. My name is Romeo Santos, Philippines. My question is addressed to Ms. Kelly of ADB and Christine of World Bank, and of course to all the panel members. You mentioned about private sector, and you emphasize you're talking about real markets, and you enumerated components of this or features of this, such as supply and demand, market access, competitions, market penetration, and perhaps market impediments. I didn't hear any word of profit. Is profit involved in this? Now, we all know that in the private sector, performance is measured and boils down to profit. It's always like that. Such that we evaluators, when we are telling the private sector and compare it to the public sector, it would be a kind of a dilemma to reconcile this. Because, in the public sector, we are looking at the higher level result, which is more of the uplifting the quality of life of the people. Now, in the private sector, it boils down to profit. And that's where effectiveness is. I think there is some kind of a problem in that. And you mentioned about you are measuring on the output. So does it imply that it's not a results-based approach that you are doing? If you measure efficiency or effectiveness of private firm, for example, and you are there at the profit, there might be kind of a scenario that intervention may be uplifting the quality of life of the people, but it's not profitable to a particular firm. How is that?
I agree. That's where the gap is, and this is the sort of discussion I want, because there is a gap between, especially using public sector funds to incentivize market transformation, which is necessary for sustainability. So you can't decouple the two. They are coupled, and both aspects, the public policy enabling environment plus the real market transformational environment, they go hand in hand for real sustainability. So in terms of the question regarding private sector and profits, private sector is private sector. It's going to operate as it would in the society or in the environment it's operating. If it's a free market society, it's going to be looking at internal rates of return to ascertain whether or not it's going to be worth its while to invest in the specific market, whether there's policy or not. Even if there is policy, is the policy sufficient to make the return on investment sufficient for that private investor or the group of private investors that you want to come in to have a competitive market? So yes, you are quite correct in regard to these issues can't be swept under the carpet, because with regard to carbon investment funding and what we are trying to do with regard to transformation, these private sector questions have to be answered and have to be looked at appropriately in regard to evaluation.
just wanted to say a thing, and then I would also like Christine to add to it. I mean, just to add to what you said, I think in the private sector looks essentially for two things. I mean, one is of course profit, and the other is more long-term wealth and asset creation. So I think we have to keep that in perspective. Applying the same thing in this, over the short term, any commercial activity, you invest upfront, and then the rewards are reaped over a period of time. So that temporal dimension of private sector involvement has to be kept in mind. Christine, you may want to add.
Yeah, I think it's public funds that are used. So, I think the way to report is, for example, we are looking for an increase in gigawatt hours of renewable energy installed. So, but the assumption behind that is, of course, that if there is more renewable being installed, also maybe the feed-in tariffs, there's better negotiation possibility for those feed-in tariffs, and the renewable energy as a whole can take off, and then that leads to market transformation and a lot more business opportunities, and of course indirectly or very directly for the private sector to profit. But this is not really, the language we feed back to the taxpayers who invest in the public sector funds in the first place. So so I think it's hidden in this market transformation, increase of renewable energy technology, increase of market increase.
But a supplementary question to that is, how much of CIF funds are themselves performance-based in terms of, are there incentives for better performing economies to have access to higher funds? I mean, you mentioned range of countries in both in South and Southeast Asia. So if a country does more, does it open up more windows of funding under the CIF, or is that something further along the line?
There's a discussion going on about that, and I cannot answer that just yet. But there's a real question about funds that haven't been allocated. Should they be allocated on a competitive basis to those who, or should they be allocated on a sort of geographical and equity basis? Same for all. That's a question not answered yet, but very interesting.
Yeah, and you were talking about allocation of resources then, like.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to add around private sector, one of the things in the context of the Conclave's evaluation we found really useful in some of the policy deep dives was actually to do a bunch of interviews with industry leaders to get a sense of, are the policies that advocacy groups are pushing for really likely to unleash this virtual cycle of engaging market forces to drive investment in the area and greenhouse gas mitigation. And I think in some areas we actually found that the foundations and the NGOs didn't really have as strong a connections as they may need to really understand how to transform renewable energy and energy efficiency markets in particular in some of the case studies, and particularly in complex areas such as financing mechanisms and what are those public policies that really drive change. So I see tremendous opportunity from an evaluation standpoint to reach beyond the comfort zone of the organizations that that you're used to working with, and make sure those voices are included in the evaluation process, because I think it can give a lot richer information yeah.
Maybe just to mention, in the CIFs, for example, under the Clean Technology Fund, and the money is sort of seen as catalyst money. I think the current ratio is that $1 CIF money attracts $8 on co-funding, so there's huge leverage ratio in it, and that's what can enhance the market attractiveness.
So $8 to every dollar. Yeah, on the CDF, sorry. Yeah.
Albert Salmakar from the Stockholm Environment Institute. I just want to link this panel with the plenary earlier. I was wondering, from where you are, from your organizations, what role there is for participatory evaluation. Because at the end of the day, when we talk about climate change, we're talking about people and countries who are really physically affected by climate change. It's not about markets or the private sector.
That's right. I think that's a big element in the room. I mean, is there room for participatory approaches to evaluation, given this complexity or whatever?
I can say that as part of independent evaluation, there is always opportunity for focus groups to be included in whatever in-field mission takes place. And I know it's not limited to just the Asian Development Bank. I know that the other multilateral banks also include focus group opportunities. Sure, there's one-on-one Q&A where you go to the individual stakeholders, but there's also survey work. Obviously, that doesn't always work. You also have the issue of reaching out and actually going into the individual location, depending on what the actual project is. I mean, obviously, if the target audience are individual households or individual businesses, there's greater opportunity to either have representation by civil society of consumer groups or of small businesses, or simply speaking to leading leading businesses or groups in a village. So there's opportunity for diversity with regard to evaluation approach. Now the issue is always timing and resource, and that's going to always be a limitation no matter what evaluation group you're with. So yes, indeed, there is opportunity for participatory give and take when it comes to independent evaluation.
I wish we could just go on. I mean, unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I'll just take one last question and then we'll move on. For those of you who are really interested, and it's I can understand, I mean, this 1 hour is just clearly not enough to discuss, have a meaningful discussion. So what we were proposing is that some of us, I mean, the panelists would be here during the lunchtime. We could actually, for those of you who are interested in a more in-depth and more informal discussion, some of the questions which we are not able to answer here or discuss, we could meet over lunch and sit down maybe in this room itself and then have a more continuous. So a last question from the gentleman there, and I think then we'll move on to theme 2.
My question was just getting back to something Kelly said earlier about drawing an analogy. You mentioned the work that's been done on energy efficiency and then you also talked about the need to measure market transformation variables in climate. But if you look at energy efficiency, in fact, the early history of evaluation in energy efficiency was all about technology adoption and technology dissemination. And it was because you have a good measure of the outcome variable, electricity use or oil use, that you start to find studies saying that technology adoption is not necessarily leading to electricity reduction. So for example, the causal impact of the target, which is, penetration of a particular technology or a number of amount of subsidies given, is not getting linked to electricity. Now when you look at climate as a counterpart, wouldn't you feel that in some sense all we're talking about is markets? For example, we have a lot of discussion about the carbon market in the EU, but one of the things we don't know is how many leakages are occurring where monitoring isn't taking place. So is the weakness that we aren't talking enough about markets, or is the weakness that we aren't measuring the outcome variable well enough across it?
I think it's a combination of both, and I say that not with tongue-in-cheek. I really sincerely believe that the issue, first and foremost, as was the case in the 90s, is behavioral change. And behavioral change is an issue on both the social side in terms of publicly funded projects and getting people to understand the benefits associated with energy efficiency. And then there's behavioral change on the market side. Is there enough incentive for players to come into the market? Has the market been transformed? Is there sufficient pricing mechanisms, etc.? So I see it on both sides. When you get into the market sort of participation issue, then you can answer the technical question. These appliances, for example, just really quickly, because I know we're trying to wrap up, some of the high efficiency pieces of equipment that obviously grew in terms of availability and perhaps in terms of sales because of knowledge transfer and information taking place. What effect did it ultimately have on savings, energy use savings, energy demand? What power plant was foregone as a result of such an initiative? So they all are interlinked. You can't separate the three, the social aspect, social political aspect, the market aspect, and the technical aspect. They're all tied in together. And that's like the triangulation process of making certain you dot each point with regard to ascertaining what the results really are. But we could talk about this forever. But yeah, they all are important.
I think in the area you mentioned, there's a lot to learn. So the approach we take in the SIFs is actually, routine monitoring and reporting is not enough. So we encourage projects when they are designed to build an evaluation component into it. So for example, in Mexico, there is a project that invests into energy efficient housing. But actually energy efficient housing is only one side of the coin. The energy consumption will actually depend on the use, and we know very little about the interplay of the both. So there's an evaluability component built into the project design which will deliver real-time evaluation results and feed them back into project delivery and allow for adjustment. So I think, routine monitoring and reporting is not enough. Through in-depth evaluation that's built in real time into project design and enhances the learning, through the combination of those both instruments, we can improve our knowledge in areas as new as adaptation, for example.
Okay. I'm afraid I do really have to close this theme. It's a shame we don't have more time, but as I said, we'd be happy to discuss this over lunch. May I now invite, okay, so lunch would be at the poolside area at 12:45. So maybe we can find a table there close to that area where we can all reassemble for those of you